Labour has accused the government of the previous Conservative government of covering up the funding gap in the public finances. Tomorrow, the Chancellor Rachel Reeves is expected to set out the details of a £20 billion a year black hole in the overall budget after an audit of government departments. On Times Radio this morning, the Environment Secretary Steve Reed was pressed on whether the government is laying the ground for tax increases and spending cuts.
Well, we have to look at where the Conservatives have made spending commitments without identifying where the money's coming from. Of course, we have to look at that, and that's what Rachel will do. But what's going on across government now, in my department, which is the Department for the Environment, every other department, we're going through a spending review process. We're all trying to identify where are these overspends that the Conservatives failed to control? How can we do better for less? How can we change the way that the government is working to deliver the outcomes people want, but without spending so much money? By the time we get to the autumn, all of that will be brought together for Rachel Reeves. She will then take decisions on how we make sure we stabilise the finances. But the key point is, if we don't stabilise the finances, if we fail to grow the economy as the Conservatives did, then you end up in this doom loop.
Steve Reed. Well, the Conservatives have accused Labour of lying and said the Office for Budget Responsibility regularly publishes updates on the state of the public finances. Speaking to Times Radio this morning, the Shadow Paymaster General John Glenn said the previous government did not conceal the scale of the black hole in the public finances. Well, Martin Weale is a former member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee. Good afternoon to you, Martin.
Hello.
Good to have you with us. Do you think that Labour has grounds to say that the previous Tory government concealed the scale of this black hole in the public finances, the number of unfunded departmental commitments?
Well, I don't think I can possibly know because I haven't seen the details. I haven't seen the details that the Conservatives left behind, nor have I seen the items that the new government is saying require spending on that weren't covered. But people have been mentioning a number of items. One is the cost of compensation for the blood scandal. Another is the fact that the independent pay review body, admittedly this was after the general election, recommended increases in public sector pay higher than the previous government had budgeted for. That said, what they're recommending is only in line with the way in which private sector pay is going up at the moment. So you can certainly argue that the previous figures were unrealistic. Then, of course, we're hearing about how the prisons are full to bursting and how extra money needs to be spent on prisons. I mean, my view is that there are far too many people in prison anyway, and prison is right for some criminals, but not for all of them. But that's, of course, a separate matter.
But wouldn't all of these facts and all these figures have been available before the election? Figures had already been put out in Parliament on the costs of compensating, for example, the contaminated blood issue. We, of course, have those figures that are put out on a regular basis by the Office for Budget Responsibility. Wouldn't Labour and anyone who looked closely at this, as the Institute for Fiscal Studies have done, be able to say, look, all these figures were there even before the election?
Well, could I remind you what the chairman of the OBR said, that the government's spending plans weren't even a work of fiction? No, Conservative politicians are now saying that the OBR was delivering transparency, but certainly I think their sense was that the spending plans required unspecified cuts to government spending, and it wasn't clear where they would be delivered.
So indeed, the OBR had already been warning about this before the election.
Well, I think you can certainly interpret some of the things they've been saying as indicating that, yes.
And the Institute for Fiscal Studies, of course, was also warning, a very respected think tank, before voters went to the polls, saying that neither Labour nor the Conservatives were being honest about the lack of money that there was for various projects, and the fact that neither of them had made it clear where the money was going to come from to fulfill those spending commitments.
I think that's absolutely right. Uh, the Labour Party have been saying that they'll follow Conservative spending plans and they'll stick to the fiscal rule, which is that the national debt should be falling relative to national income late in the forecast. Well, to meet that, all you need to forecast is that debt is going to come down relative to income, but it never needs actually to happen. And of course, the other thing to remember is that we now have a high level of debt relative to income. It's back to where it was in the early 1960s. And if there are further, another epidemic, some other crisis, the scope for letting the debt rise further isn't what it was. So you might well argue that a more concerted effort is needed to bring the debt down, that the government, instead of being happy running a substantial deficit, should perhaps be aiming at a surplus.
The Labour government, of course, has again reiterated that it's not going to be increasing the main rates of income tax, national insurance, or VAT. But do you think that what's happening here is laying the ground for either tax increases or more cuts to public spending when we know that so many departments, justice, as you've already mentioned, the prisons, defence, the NHS, education, are all saying that they desperately need more money?
Well, I think we probably will see tax increases. And of course, people talk about how, with the commitments that the Labour government has made, there isn't a lot of room for increasing the big taxes: income tax, value added tax, national insurance, corporation tax, and so on. So a lot of people are thinking that something will be done with capital gains tax and inheritance tax. But what I'd also remind you is that we may see some new taxes. 30 years ago, Ken Clarke introduced an insurance premium tax when revenue was needed, and perhaps we'll see something else like that happening.
Let me just ask you also about the forthcoming decision by the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee on interest rates coming up later this week. How do you think that's looking? Is there much prospect that the committee will decide to bring down interest rates, as I'm sure an awful lot of people with mortgages would like?
Well, if I were on the committee, then I think I'd probably be voting to hold the interest rate where it is at the moment. Obviously, with inflation at 2%, it's easy to say, why can't rates come down now they've done their job? But if you look at movements in underlying costs, for example, the rate that wages are growing at, it's very hard to argue that that's consistent with keeping inflation close to its 2% target. And from previous comments that members of the MPC have made, we do know that they tend to focus on what's happening to underlying costs at least as much as what's happening to the headline rate of inflation.